I'm Margaret Sullivan, 69 years old, and this is the story of how my son-in-law learned that calling an Air Force comptroller and fraud investigator just a payroll clerk is the kind of mistake that ends with federal securities fraud charges and asset seizure measured in billions of dollars. Especially when that comptroller spent 27 years auditing defense budgets, investigating financial crimes, and learning to recognize patterns of fraud that most civilian auditors would never see. 6 weeks after we buried my husband Robert, my son-in-law Preston Whitmore walked into my home carrying an expensive leather briefcase and wearing a custom suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. He was 38 years old, a managing director at an exclusive Wall Street investment firm called Whitmore Capital Management, drove a Bentley, and had the kind of polished arrogance that came from years of convincing wealthy people he could make them wealthier. He sat down at my dining room table without asking permission and immediately started talking to me like I was a confused elderly woman who needed professional help managing basic financial affairs. Before I tell you how Preston learned that Air Force financial officers don't just process paychecks and that underestimating someone who spent nearly 3 decades investigating fraud in billion-dollar defense budgets is catastrophically stupid, I need you to do something. If this story speaks to you, if you've ever been dismissed because someone thought your military finance work was just clerical tasks, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because what happens next will show you why military comptroller training creates fraud detection capabilities that Wall Street fraudsters can't even comprehend. And leave a comment telling me about a time someone reduced your financial expertise to simple bookkeeping. Your stories matter and I read every single one. Preston opened his briefcase and pulled out documents he'd prepared about what he called my financial situation. He explained that he'd been reviewing my assets after Robert's death and was concerned about how I was managing them. I was 69 years old, he said, living alone with no one to help me understand complex financial matters. My assets included the house Robert and I had owned for 30 years, retirement accounts from both our military careers, some investments we'd accumulated over decades, and Robert's life insurance policy. Preston estimated my total net worth at approximately $2.8 million, which he characterized as a substantial amount that required professional management. He said he wanted to help me because my daughter Caroline would have wanted him to take care of her mother. Caroline had been his wife for 12 years before dying from cancer 18 months ago, a devastating loss that had left me without my only child and had made Preston my only close family connection. Preston presented himself as concerned about my welfare and wanting to ensure I was financially secure for the rest of my life. Preston explained that at my age, I needed professional wealth management to ensure my assets were properly invested, generated sufficient income, and were protected from market volatility and inflation. He had a fiduciary responsibility to his late wife's mother, he said, to make sure I didn't make poor financial decisions that could jeopardize my security. He'd brought documents that would give him power of attorney over my financial accounts, allow him to manage my investments through his firm, and ensure everything was handled professionally. He showed me glossy marketing materials for Whitmore Capital Management describing the firm's investment strategies, their track record of exceptional returns, and testimonials from satisfied high-net-worth clients. The firm specialized in exclusive investment opportunities that weren't available to ordinary investors, Preston explained. They had access to pre-IPO companies, private equity deals, hedge fund strategies, and international opportunities that generated returns far exceeding what traditional investments offered. His clients averaged 20 to 25% annual returns, he said, compared to the 8 to 10% that conventional investment advisors might achieve. Preston said my current financial arrangement was completely inadequate for someone with my level of assets. I had money sitting in simple index funds and treasury bonds, investments that Robert and I had chosen deliberately for their safety and reliability. Preston said those were outdated approaches that would cause my assets to lose value to inflation. I needed sophisticated wealth management using modern financial strategies. He was offering to bring me into Whitmore Capital Management's exclusive client group, normally reserved for people with at least $5 million in assets. But he was making an exception because I was family. He explained his fee structure, 2% of assets under management annually, plus 20% of investment gains above a benchmark return. He characterized this as standard for high-end wealth management and emphasized that the superior returns his firm generated would far exceed the fees. He said I should think of the fees as paying for expertise that would make me substantially wealthier than I could become managing investments myself. Then Preston said something that revealed exactly how little he understood about my background and capabilities. He said he knew I'd worked in the Air Force doing something with finance, probably processing payroll or managing accounting records. That was fine for a military career, he said, but it hadn't prepared me to understand sophisticated investment strategies, complex financial instruments, or wealth management principles. Modern finance was far more advanced than the simple bookkeeping I'd done in uniform. I shouldn't feel bad about not understanding these concepts, he emphasized. Most people, even educated professionals, couldn't comprehend the complexity of what firms like Whitmore Capital Management did. I sat at my dining room table and said nothing, which Preston interpreted as confused agreement rather than the calculated assessment I'd learned during 27 years of auditing financial operations and investigating fraud. He kept talking, becoming more expansive about the investment opportunities he could provide. He mentioned specific deals his firm was working on, pre-IPO technology companies, international real estate developments, private debt offerings, cryptocurrency hedge funds. He threw around terms like derivatives, structured products, collateralized debt obligations, and algorithmic trading, clearly confident I wouldn't understand any of it. I asked Preston where Whitmore Capital Management was registered and regulated. He said the firm was properly registered with all necessary regulatory bodies and had pristine compliance records. I asked if the firm was registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission as a registered investment advisor. Preston said the firm operated under exemptions that didn't require full SEC registration because they only served sophisticated high-net-worth investors who didn't need regulatory protection. I asked what specific exemptions allowed a firm managing client investments to avoid SEC registration. Preston said it was a complex regulatory matter that his compliance attorneys handled and I shouldn't worry about technical details. I asked Preston about the 20 to 25% annual returns he claimed his firm generated. I mentioned that Warren Buffett, arguably the most successful investor in history, had averaged about 20% annually over his entire career. How was Preston's firm consistently matching or exceeding Buffett's historic performance? Preston said Buffett was investing in public markets with traditional strategies, while Whitmore Capital Management had access to exclusive opportunities that generated superior returns. He said it was comparing apples to oranges and I shouldn't be skeptical just because the returns seemed high to someone without financial sophistication. Here's what Preston didn't know, what he'd never bothered to ask about or investigate because he'd been so certain that Air Force finance work was just processing paychecks and maintaining ledgers. Preston didn't know that I hadn't been a simple payroll clerk or bookkeeper in the Air Force. I'd been a comptroller officer rising to the rank of full colonel, responsible for auditing and managing budgets measured in billions of dollars. I'd overseen financial operations for major commands, managed appropriated fund expenditures for entire air bases, and conducted fraud investigations when financial irregularities were detected. Preston didn't know that my education included a bachelor's degree in accounting from Penn State, a master's degree in financial management from the Air Force Institute of Technology, and that I was a licensed certified public accountant, a certified fraud examiner, and a certified information systems auditor. I'd completed the Defense Financial Management and Comptroller School's most advanced programs. I'd been trained by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations in financial fraud detection. I'd testified as an expert witness in multiple courts-martial involving financial crimes. Preston didn't know that during my 27 years in the Air Force, I'd investigated dozens of fraud schemes involving military contractors, embezzling officers, procurement fraud, and financial misconduct. I'd personally led investigations that recovered tens of millions of dollars and sent multiple people to military prison. I'd audited programs where contractors had tried to overcharge the government by millions through creative accounting, and I'd caught them through detailed analysis of financial records and contracts. I'd seen every variety of financial fraud, from simple embezzlement to sophisticated multi-year schemes involving shell companies and offshore accounts. Preston didn't know that after retiring from the Air Force, I'd worked as a consultant for the Defense Contract Audit Agency and for the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, conducting financial audits and fraud investigations on major defense contractors. I'd also done consulting work for the SEC's Division of Enforcement, helping them understand complex financial frauds that had military contracting connections. I still had active consulting relationships and security clearances because my expertise in financial fraud detection was in high demand. Most importantly, Preston didn't know that everything he'd described about Whitmore Capital Management had immediately triggered red flags for someone with my background. The claimed returns of 20 to 25% annually were mathematically suspicious and consistent with Ponzi scheme patterns. The fee structure of 2% plus 20% was excessive even by hedge fund standards. The vague descriptions of exclusive investment opportunities and sophisticated strategies were classic fraud indicators. The claim of operating under exemptions from SEC registration was almost certainly false. There are very limited exemptions, and a firm actively soliciting clients wouldn't qualify. And the pressure to sign documents giving him control of my assets immediately was a coercive tactic I'd seen in numerous fraud cases. When Preston finished his presentation, he pushed the power of attorney documents across the table toward me. He said I should sign them today so he could get started protecting my financial future immediately. He had his pen ready and showed me where to sign. He said this was the responsible thing to do and that Caroline would have wanted me to let him help. I looked at those documents for a long moment. Then I told Preston no. I wasn't signing anything. I had serious concerns about whether Whitmore Capital Management was operating legally and whether the investment returns he claimed were real or were the result of a Ponzi scheme where early investors were being paid with money from new investors rather than from actual investment profits. Preston's expression shifted from patronizing patience to barely controlled anger. He said I was being insulting and paranoid. His firm was completely legitimate, highly successful, and managed money for some of the wealthiest families in America. If I wasn't going to accept his help, fine, but I shouldn't make baseless accusations about a prestigious firm I knew nothing about. He said this was exactly the problem with military people. They were so used to following rigid rules that they couldn't understand how sophisticated civilian financial markets worked. They saw fraud where there was just success they couldn't comprehend. Then Preston said something that made me absolutely certain I was right about him. He said that if I spread accusations about Whitmore Capital Management, there would be serious legal consequences. He had attorneys who protected the firm from defamation, and they wouldn't hesitate to sue me for everything I had if I damaged the firm's reputation. He said I should think very carefully about whether I wanted to spend my retirement fighting expensive lawsuits I couldn't afford to defend. It was a direct threat, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd used intimidation successfully before. That threat confirmed everything. Legitimate investment firms don't threaten elderly widows who decline their services. They don't warn people to keep quiet about concerns. Preston's reaction told me he was running a fraud and was worried about someone with financial expertise looking too closely at his operation. After Preston left, I sat at my dining room table thinking about Caroline and about how she'd died. The official cause was cancer, but I'd always wondered about the timing. She'd been diagnosed suddenly with an aggressive form of cancer, had declined rapidly despite treatment, and had died within 6 months. I'd questioned at the time whether it was really just bad luck or whether there might have been something more to it. Now I was wondering if Caroline had discovered something about Preston's business and if her death had been more convenient for him than I'd realized. I went to my study and pulled out files I'd been maintaining since Caroline's death. I'd been quietly researching Preston because something about him had always bothered me. I had copies of Whitmore Capital Management's public filings, SEC registration documents, news articles about the firm, and preliminary analysis I'd done of their claimed performance. I also had some of Caroline's personal papers that she'd left with me before she died, papers that Preston didn't know existed. I also pulled out my references from 27 years of Air Force financial investigations. My understanding of how Ponzi schemes worked and how to detect them. My contacts at the SEC, FBI, and other regulatory and law enforcement agencies. My training in financial forensics and fraud examination. my experience testifying about complex financial crimes. Preston thought he'd been talking to a simple payroll clerk, an old woman who'd spent her career doing basic bookkeeping in the military and didn't understand sophisticated finance. What he'd actually done was describe what sounded very much like a Ponzi scheme to someone who'd spent nearly 3 decades investigating financial fraud. And then he'd threatened that person to keep quiet, which was possibly the stupidest tactical error he could have made. I made my first call to Colonel Rhett James Patterson, who'd worked with me in Air Force financial investigations before retiring and joining the FBI's financial crimes section. I told him I needed to discuss what appeared to be a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme being operated by a Wall Street investment firm. James said he'd be very interested in that conversation and asked if this involved Whitmore Capital Management. Apparently Preston's firm had already attracted attention from financial crimes investigators. My second call was to Sarah Chen, who'd been a junior auditor working under me before leaving the Air Force and joining the SEC's Division of Enforcement. I told her I had evidence of what appeared to be securities fraud involving false performance claims, unregistered investment advisor activity, and possible Ponzi scheme operations. Sarah said the SEC had received some complaints about Whitmore Capital Management but hadn't had enough evidence to open a formal investigation. My third call was to Michael Torres, a forensic accountant I'd worked with on multiple defense contractor fraud cases who now ran his own firm specializing in financial fraud investigation. I asked if he'd be willing to analyze the financial statements and performance claims of an investment firm I suspected was operating fraudulently. Michael said absolutely and asked me to send whatever I had. Over the next week, I did what I'd spent 27 years learning to do in the Air Force. I conducted a systematic financial audit and fraud investigation. I gathered documentation, analyzed financial records, identified patterns inconsistent with legitimate operations, and built a comprehensive case. Preston thought I was just some confused old woman who declined his help. What I was actually doing was applying sophisticated fraud detection techniques I'd used to expose contractor fraud, embezzlement schemes, and financial crimes throughout my military career. The investigation was beginning. And Preston was about to learn that Air Force controllers aren't payroll clerks. We're trained financial investigators who've seen every type of fraud scheme and who know exactly how to dismantle fraudulent operations with methodical precision and overwhelming evidence. The morning after Preston's visit, I woke at 0500 with the same internal discipline that had governed my schedule throughout 27 years of Air Force service. I made coffee, completed my morning routine, and sat down at my desk to begin a systematic financial audit and fraud investigation of Whitmore Capital Management. I'd conducted hundreds of financial audits during my military career, examining everything from small procurement contracts to billion-dollar weapons programs. The methodology was the same regardless of scale: gather documentation, analyze financial flows, identify inconsistencies, and build a comprehensive evidence package. I started with public records and regulatory filings. Whitmore Capital Management was registered with the SEC as a registered investment advisor, which contradicted Preston's claim that they operated under exemptions. I pulled their Form ADV filings, which investment advisors are required to submit disclosing their business practices, fees, conflicts of interest, and disciplinary history. The filings showed the firm claimed to manage approximately $4.2 billion in client assets and had been operating for 8 years. The fee structure was disclosed as 2% of assets under management plus performance fees, exactly as Preston had described. But the Form ADV also revealed concerning information. The firm had received 3 regulatory inquiries in the past 2 years from state securities regulators and from FINRA regarding performance claims and fee disclosures. The firm's explanation for these inquiries was vague, claiming they were routine examinations that had been resolved satisfactorily. Having conducted regulatory compliance audits for decades, I knew that multiple regulatory inquiries in a short period wasn't routine. It suggested regulators had concerns but hadn't yet gathered sufficient evidence for enforcement action. I examined Whitmore Capital Management's marketing materials and performance claims more carefully. They advertised consistent annual returns of 20 to 25% with very low volatility. Their performance charts showed steady upward trajectories with almost no down periods, even during market corrections when virtually all investment managers showed losses. This pattern was statistically improbable for legitimate investment returns. Real investment performance, even from the best managers, shows volatility and periodic losses. Smooth, consistently high returns were a classic indicator of fabricated performance, the kind of pattern Ponzi schemes created by paying returns from new investor money rather than from actual investment profits. I analyzed the investment strategies Whitmore Capital Management claimed to use. They described proprietary algorithms, exclusive pre-IPO access, private equity opportunities, and sophisticated derivative strategies. But the descriptions were vague and didn't include the specific details that legitimate investment firms provided. After spending years auditing defense contractors who tried to hide fraud behind technical jargon and complexity, I recognized the pattern: use impressive-sounding terms without providing substantive details that could be verified or challenged. James Patterson from the FBI Financial Crimes Section called with preliminary information from bureau databases. The FBI had been receiving complaints about Whitmore Capital Management for approximately 18 months. Several investors had reported difficulty withdrawing their money, receiving vague excuses about liquidity issues or market timing concerns. One investor had filed a complaint claiming their account statements showed growth, but when they tried to withdraw funds, they were told the money wasn't actually available due to being locked in illiquid investments. James said these complaints fit classic Ponzi scheme patterns where early withdrawals were paid from new investor money, but as the scheme matured, the operator struggled to meet redemption requests. James also said the Bureau had been hesitant to move forward with a formal investigation because Whitmore Capital Management had expensive attorneys who threatened litigation against anyone who questioned the firm's operations. Several complainants had been intimidated into withdrawing their complaints or signing non-disclosure agreements in exchange for eventually receiving their money back. This use of legal threats to silence victims was another classic fraud indicator I'd seen repeatedly during financial crime investigations. Sarah Chen from the SEC Division of Enforcement called with information from the Commission's files. The SEC had received anonymous tips about Whitmore Capital Management suggesting the firm was operating a Ponzi scheme, but the tips hadn't included specific evidence. The SEC had considered opening an examination of the firm but had been deterred by the firm's aggressive legal responses to previous regulatory inquiries. Sarah said the SEC was understaffed and had to prioritize cases where they had strong evidence, and they hadn't had sufficient grounds to force a comprehensive examination of Whitmore Capital Management's operations. Sarah mentioned something particularly concerning. The SEC had identified approximately 30 investment firms over the past decade that had similar characteristics: exclusive high-net-worth client bases, exceptional claimed returns, vague investment strategies, and aggressive use of legal threats against anyone who questioned them. 10 of these firms had eventually been exposed as Ponzi schemes after they collapsed, in several cases only after operating for over a decade and defrauding investors of billions of dollars. Whitmore Capital Management fit the profile exactly, suggesting it might be a sophisticated fraud that simply hadn't collapsed yet. Michael Torres, my forensic accountant contact, called after analyzing the financial documents I'd sent him. His preliminary assessment was that Whitmore Capital Management's claimed performance was mathematically implausible. The returns they advertised required either taking enormous risks that would inevitably result in catastrophic losses eventually, or the returns were fabricated. Michael had analyzed the correlation between Whitmore's claimed returns and various market indices and found almost no correlation. Their performance went up steadily regardless of whether stocks, bonds, commodities, or any other asset class were rising or falling. That kind of performance wasn't achievable through legitimate trading strategies. Michael also analyzed the fee structure and did mathematical modeling of how much money the firm would need to generate in actual investment profits to pay both the claimed investor returns and the firm's own fees. The numbers didn't work. If the firm was actually generating the returns they claimed and charging the fees they disclosed, they'd need to be achieving gross returns of over 30% annually before fees. That level of consistent performance was virtually impossible over 8 years. The only way the numbers made sense was if the firm wasn't actually investing money but was instead running a Ponzi scheme where investor statements showed growth that didn't reflect real assets. I spent the next several days conducting the kind of detailed financial analysis I'd done throughout my Air Force career investigating fraud. I obtained Whitmore Capital Management's audited financial statements, which were required as part of their SEC registration. The audits were conducted by a small accounting firm I'd never heard of rather than one of the major auditing firms. That was immediately suspicious. A firm managing $4 billion should have been using a top-tier auditor. Small accounting firms lacked the resources and expertise to properly audit complex investment operations and were more easily intimidated or deceived by fraudulent clients. I examined the audited financial statements in detail using techniques I'd learned from decades of financial investigations. The statements showed assets under management of approximately $4.2 billion, matching the firm's claims. But the asset composition was concerning. Rather than showing diversified holdings in stocks, bonds, and other standard investments, the statements showed most assets classified as partnership interests, private placements, and other illiquid investments that were difficult to independently value. This was another classic fraud indicator. Claiming assets were held in forms that couldn't easily be verified allowed operators to fabricate valuations. I also found accounting irregularities that suggested the financial statements weren't reliable. Revenue recognition didn't follow standard practices for investment advisory firms. Expense classifications were unusual and appeared designed to hide the true cost structure. Related party transactions were disclosed vaguely without sufficient detail to understand what was actually happening. Having audited hundreds of financial statements and identified fraud through exactly these kinds of irregularities, I recognized the patterns immediately. I pulled Caroline's personal papers that she'd left with me before she died. Hidden among routine documents was a folder labeled Household Accounts but actually containing financial records from Whitmore Capital Management that Caroline had somehow accessed. The records showed internal accounting that contradicted the firm's public financial statements and client account statements. The internal records showed the firm had far less in actual assets than claimed, with most investor money either spent on operating expenses and Preston's personal lifestyle or used to pay redemptions and fake returns to other investors. The folder also contained a letter Caroline had written but never sent, addressed to me. She explained that she'd discovered Preston was running a Ponzi scheme, that most of the firm's claimed assets didn't actually exist, and that he'd been stealing client money for years. She'd been planning to report him to authorities but wanted to gather comprehensive evidence first. The letter was dated 3 weeks before she was diagnosed with the aggressive cancer that killed her within 6 months. Caroline asked that if anything happened to her, I should make sure the evidence reached regulators and that Preston was held accountable. I sat in my study holding Caroline's letter, understanding that my daughter had discovered her husband's massive fraud and that her sudden death had been remarkably convenient for him. I couldn't prove Preston had murdered her. Rapid cancer was certainly possible naturally, but the timing was suspicious. Caroline had been healthy, had just had a normal checkup, and then suddenly had stage 4 cancer that killed her before she could report Preston's fraud. I made a note to have forensic pathologists review her medical records to determine if there were any indicators of poisoning that could mimic cancer symptoms. Over the next week, I continued building the case using every technique I'd learned from 27 years of financial investigations. I identified specific investors in Whitmore Capital Management and reached out to them discreetly. Several were willing to talk confidentially, and their accounts confirmed Ponzi scheme patterns. They'd invested money years ago, had received consistent returns on paper, but when they tried to withdraw significant amounts, they faced obstacles and delays. One investor who'd eventually received their money back said it had taken over a year and constant pressure, suggesting the firm had struggled to find enough new investor money to cover the redemption. I also discovered that Preston had been actively recruiting new investors at an accelerating pace over the past 2 years. He'd been targeting wealthy retirees, people like me who had accumulated substantial assets and might not be sophisticated about detecting investment fraud. This acceleration in recruiting was another Ponzi scheme indicator. As the scheme matured and more investors wanted to withdraw money, operators needed to bring in new money faster to keep paying returns and redemptions. Preston's attempt to bring me in as a client wasn't generosity, it was desperation to access my $2.8 million to keep his scheme afloat. I analyzed Whitmore Capital Management's operational expenses using techniques I'd used investigating defense contractor fraud. The firm's overhead was excessive relative to their claimed business model. They had expensive Manhattan offices, large staff, significant travel expenses, and compensation for Preston and other principals that totaled tens of millions annually. If the firm was legitimately managing money and earning fees, the expense structure made sense. But if the firm was a Ponzi scheme with no real investment operations, these expenses were being paid from investor money rather than from legitimate fee income. I traced money flows using forensic accounting techniques, examining bank records I obtained through sources I developed during my consulting work with financial regulators. The money flows showed classic Ponzi scheme circulation, investor money coming in, some money going to pay returns and redemptions to existing investors, large amounts going to firm expenses and Preston's personal accounts, but very little money actually being invested in securities or other legitimate assets. Preston was essentially running an expensive lifestyle and paying fake returns all from investor money while claiming to be a successful investment manager. 2 weeks into my investigation, Preston came to my house again. He said he wanted to follow up on our previous conversation and give me another chance to let him help manage my assets. He brought updated marketing materials showing even more impressive recent performance, testimonials from additional satisfied clients, and revised documents that he said addressed any concerns I might have had. He was more aggressive this time, suggesting that I was being stubborn and foolish by not accepting professional help, and that I was jeopardizing my financial security through pride and stubbornness. I asked Preston specific questions designed to elicit information I could use as evidence. I asked about the firm's custody arrangements, where client assets were actually held and who had independent oversight. Preston gave vague answers suggesting the firm had custody of assets themselves, which was highly irregular and violated standard industry practices requiring independent custodians. I asked about the auditing firm that reviewed their financial statements and why they didn't use a major accounting firm. Preston said small firms provided more personalized service, which was an absurd explanation for a firm managing billions. I asked Preston about several specific investments Whitmore Capital Management claimed to have made based on their marketing materials. I asked for details about returns, exit strategies, and current valuations. Preston provided general answers without specific details, clearly uncomfortable with questions that required actual knowledge of real investments. I asked if I could speak with the firm's chief investment officer or portfolio managers to understand their strategies better before committing my assets. Preston said that wouldn't be possible because the firm's strategies were proprietary and they didn't expose their investment team to potential clients. Then I asked Preston about client redemptions. I said I wanted to understand the process for withdrawing money if I needed access to my funds. Preston's demeanor changed immediately. He said redemption policies were clearly disclosed in the investment agreements, that there were reasonable notice periods and liquidity considerations, and that clients couldn't just demand immediate access to funds that were invested in sophisticated strategies. He emphasized that high net worth investing wasn't like having a savings account, money was committed to longer-term opportunities that generated superior returns. The defensive tone and the emphasis on limiting redemptions was exactly what I'd expect from someone operating a Ponzi scheme who was worried about having to return investor money. After Preston left, I immediately documented our entire conversation. His vague answers about custody and auditing, his inability to provide specific investment details, his discomfort with redemption questions, and his continued pressure for me to commit assets all provided additional evidence of fraud. Combined with everything else I'd gathered, I now had a comprehensive case showing Whitmore Capital Management was operating a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme. I called James Patterson and told him I was ready to provide the FBI with a complete financial fraud investigation package on Whitmore Capital Management. James said the Bureau was prepared to move forward with a formal investigation as soon as they had sufficient evidence to obtain search warrants and freeze assets. I told him I'd have everything ready within 72 hours. I called Sarah Chen and told her the SEC needed to coordinate with the FBI to seek an emergency asset freeze and appointment of a receiver before Preston could move or hide assets. Sarah said the SEC was ready to file civil charges simultaneously with criminal charges to ensure comprehensive action. I called Michael Torres and asked him to finalize his forensic accounting analysis in a format suitable for presentation to regulators and prosecutors. Michael said his analysis conclusively showed the firm's claimed returns were mathematically impossible through legitimate trading and that the firm was almost certainly a Ponzi scheme operating with less than 20% of the assets they claimed to hold. Over the next 3 days, I compiled everything into a comprehensive financial fraud investigation package. I organized it using the methodology I'd developed over 27 years: executive summary, detailed financial analysis, evidence documentation, expert reports, victim statements, and recommendations for investigation and prosecution. The package ran to over 500 pages including financial statements, transaction analyses, mathematical modeling, and forensic accounting reports. Preston had called me just a payroll clerk and had thought he could intimidate an old woman into handing over her life savings. He'd been running a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme for 8 years, stealing from hundreds of wealthy investors while living an extravagant lifestyle. He'd murdered my daughter, I was increasingly certain of that, when she'd discovered his fraud. He'd made the catastrophic error of underestimating an Air Force comptroller with 27 years of experience investigating financial fraud at the highest levels. Someone who'd audited billion-dollar defense programs and caught contractors trying to hide fraud through complexity and intimidation. Someone who knew exactly how to analyze financial records, identify Ponzi scheme patterns, and build prosecution cases that would withstand the most aggressive legal defense. The investigation was complete. The evidence was overwhelming. Federal agencies were coordinated and ready to act. Preston's Ponzi scheme was about to collapse, and he was about to face decades in federal prison for securities fraud and theft measured in billions. The FBI and SEC executed coordinated enforcement actions against Whitmore Capital Management at 0600 on a Tuesday morning, 4 days after I delivered my comprehensive fraud investigation package. Federal agencies don't telegraph their intentions when dismantling major financial fraud operations. They move with overwhelming speed, coordination across multiple jurisdictions, and simultaneous action to prevent asset flight or evidence destruction. Over 80 agents and investigators from the FBI, SEC, IRS Criminal Investigation, and U.S. Postal Inspection Service hit 15 locations simultaneously: Preston's home, his Manhattan office, the firm's Connecticut office, several bank locations, and the residences of key employees. James Patterson called me at 0630 to inform me the operation had been successful. Preston had been arrested at his home without incident. 7 other Whitmore Capital Management employees had been arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit securities fraud. The FBI had seized computers, servers, phones, and financial records from all locations. The SEC had obtained an emergency asset freeze from a federal judge, preventing Preston or anyone associated with the firm from moving, hiding, or spending any assets. A court-appointed receiver had been designated to take immediate control of Whitmore Capital Management's operations and begin the process of determining what assets actually existed and how much investors had lost. James said the evidence seizure had been even more productive than expected. Preston had maintained detailed records of the Ponzi scheme, apparently confident through years of successful operation that he'd never be caught. His computers contained spreadsheets showing real investor money versus the fabricated account balances he'd been reporting. He had communications with employees discussing how to handle investor redemption requests by delaying and making excuses. He'd kept records of how he'd spent investor money on personal expenses, luxury homes, exotic cars, private jets, art collections, and millions in cash withdrawals. The evidence was so comprehensive that prosecutors said they could probably prove the fraud case with Preston's own records alone. The SEC filed civil charges that morning seeking permanent injunctions, disgorgement of ill-gotten gains, and civil penalties. The SEC's complaint was public record and detailed the massive scope of Preston's fraud. Whitmore Capital Management had claimed to manage $4.2 billion in client assets. The actual assets under management were approximately $300 million, less than 10% of claimed holdings. Preston had been operating a Ponzi scheme for 8 years, paying returns and redemptions to some investors with money from other investors while stealing over $3 billion for personal use and operating expenses. The SEC complaint specifically credited an anonymous whistleblower, me, with providing the comprehensive analysis that exposed the fraud. The criminal complaint filed by the FBI and unsealed that afternoon charged Preston with securities fraud, wire fraud, investment advisor fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. The charges described how Preston had deliberately deceived hundreds of wealthy investors, fabricated performance records, created false financial statements, and stolen billions of dollars. The potential prison time if convicted on all counts exceeded 100 years. The U.S. Attorney held a press conference calling it one of the largest Ponzi schemes in American history, comparable to the Bernie Madoff case in scope though not quite as large in dollar amounts. By that evening, the financial news networks were covering the story extensively. Reporters interviewed securities law experts who explained how Ponzi schemes worked and expressed shock at how long Preston had operated without detection despite the massive scale of the fraud. Several journalists noted that wealthy, sophisticated investors had been deceived, demonstrating that financial fraud could fool even experienced businesspeople when the fraudster was sufficiently skilled at deception and used social connections and exclusive marketing to build trust. The story also mentioned that the fraud had been exposed by a military veteran with financial investigation experience who'd recognized the scheme when Preston tried to recruit them as an investor. Reporters speculated about the whistleblower's identity. Several articles noted that military financial officers received extensive fraud detection training that apparently exceeded what many civilian financial professionals learned, allowing the whistleblower to identify patterns that had fooled sophisticated investors and regulators for years. Within 48 hours of Preston's arrest, over 200 investors had contacted the court-appointed receiver reporting they had money with Whitmore Capital Management. The receiver's preliminary assessment was that actual investor losses would exceed $3 billion once all claims were tallied. Most investors had account statements showing growth over years of supposed investment, but those balances were almost entirely fictitious. The small amount of real assets that existed would provide recovery of perhaps 10 to 15 cents on the dollar for victim investors after legal fees and administrative costs. It was a devastating financial disaster for hundreds of wealthy families who'd trusted Preston with their life savings. The receiver also discovered evidence suggesting Preston had been recruiting new investors at an accelerating pace over the past year specifically because the scheme was becoming unsustainable. Redemption requests were increasing as some long-term investors reached ages where they needed to withdraw money for retirement or estate purposes. Preston needed massive new investments to cover the growing redemption demands. His attempt to bring me in as a client and access my $2.8 million had been an act of desperation by someone whose fraud was approaching collapse. If I'd given him my money, it would have disappeared into his Ponzi scheme within weeks. 3 days after Preston's arrest, federal prosecutors held a meeting with victim investors to explain the case and answer questions. I attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom while the lead prosecutor described the fraud and the evidence. The prosecutor mentioned that the investigation had been built on a comprehensive analysis provided by a financial fraud expert who'd recognized the scheme immediately upon being solicited as an investor. Several victims asked if they could thank the whistleblower personally, but the prosecutor explained my identity was being protected because of concerns about retaliation from Preston or his associates. After the meeting, several of the victim investors approached the prosecutors asking how they could have been so foolish as to fall for such an obvious fraud. The prosecutor explained that Preston's scheme hadn't been obvious, it had been sophisticated, had operated for years, and had fooled many intelligent people including some with financial expertise. The reason the whistleblower had recognized it was specialized training in fraud detection and decades of experience investigating financial crimes. Most people, even wealthy investors, didn't have that background and shouldn't feel stupid for being deceived by a professional fraudster. I listened to this from the back of the courtroom and felt a complex mixture of emotions. These were people who'd lost their life savings to Preston's fraud. Some were elderly, facing financial ruin in their final years. Some were families whose children's college funds and inheritances had disappeared. Some were charities and foundations whose endowments had been stolen. Preston's fraud had destroyed lives, And I felt genuine sympathy for the victims even though they were mostly wealthy people who'd been seeking above-market returns. 1 week after the arrests, the forensic accountants hired by the receiver released their preliminary report on the actual state of Whitmore Capital Management's finances. The report confirmed that the firm had been operating as a pure Ponzi scheme with virtually no legitimate investment activity. Of the $4.2 billion Preston claimed to manage, only $280 million existed in actual assets, stocks, bonds, and cash. The rest had been stolen over 8 years to fund Preston's lifestyle, pay firm operating expenses, and pay fabricated returns and redemptions to earlier investors. The forensic analysis showed Preston had spent over $800 million on personal expenses over 8 years. Multiple luxury homes in Manhattan, the Hamptons, Aspen, and Palm Beach. A collection of exotic cars worth over $20 million. A yacht costing $40 million. Private jet expenses exceeding $50 million. Art and wine collections worth over $100 million. Cash withdrawals and transfers to offshore accounts totaling hundreds of millions. Preston had been living like a billionaire entirely on money stolen from his investors while claiming to be a genius investment manager. The report also showed that Preston had paid out approximately $1.2 billion in fabricated returns and investor redemptions over 8 years. This was the money that had made the Ponzi scheme seem real. Early investors receiving their promised returns and being able to withdraw money created the illusion of legitimate performance and built trust that attracted more investors. Every dollar paid out had come from new investor money, not from investment profits, meaning the early investors who'd profited from the scheme had actually been paid with money stolen from later investors. The remaining stolen money, approximately $1.1 billion, had been spent on Whitmore Capital Management's operating expenses, salaries, rent, marketing, and administrative costs. The firm had employed over 60 people in expensive offices with lavish expense accounts. Preston had paid himself and other executives tens of millions in annual salaries and bonuses. The firm had spent millions on marketing to recruit new wealthy investors. All of these expenses had been paid with stolen investor money rather than from legitimate fee income, because the firm had no legitimate investment operations generating revenue. 2 weeks after Preston's arrest, his attorney attempted to negotiate a plea deal. Preston was willing to plead guilty to some charges and cooperate in the asset recovery process in exchange for a reduced sentence. The prosecutors were initially skeptical because Preston had very limited incentive to cooperate. The evidence against him was overwhelming regardless of whether he helped, and the recoverable assets had already been identified and frozen. But Preston claimed he could provide information about offshore accounts and hidden assets that investigators hadn't yet discovered. The prosecutors agreed to hear what Preston had to offer. In a proffer session, Preston admitted the full scope of his fraud and provided details about assets he'd hidden in offshore trusts and shell companies in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore. He claimed these accounts held approximately $200 million that could be recovered for victim compensation. Federal investigators immediately began working with international law enforcement to freeze these assets before Preston's foreign bankers could move or hide the money. Preston also provided information about 2 other investment managers he knew were running similar Ponzi schemes. He claimed that in the exclusive world of high-net-worth wealth management, there was an informal network of fraudsters who shared techniques for deceiving wealthy investors and evading regulatory scrutiny. Preston said he'd learned some of his methods from these other operators and that exposing them might provide some small mitigation of his own crimes. Federal investigators immediately opened investigations into the other firms Preston identified. 1 month after his arrest, Preston appeared in court for a detention hearing. His attorneys argued he should be released on bail with electronic monitoring and restrictions on financial transactions. The prosecutors argued vehemently against bail, pointing out that Preston had stolen billions, had extensive international connections, had hidden assets offshore, and had every incentive to flee the country. The judge agreed with prosecutors and ordered Preston detained pending trial, finding that no combination of bail conditions could reasonably ensure his appearance. I attended the detention hearing, sitting in the public gallery where Preston could see me. When the marshals led him into the courtroom, his eyes scanned the audience and landed on me. For a moment, we made eye contact. I saw shock and recognition. He'd clearly never imagined the confused old payroll clerk he'd dismissed would be the person who'd built the case that destroyed him. His expression shifted to something like resignation as he understood that I'd seen through his fraud immediately and had systematically gathered the evidence that would send him to prison for the rest of his life. During the hearing, the prosecutor referenced my role in exposing the fraud without naming me directly. She described how Preston had attempted to recruit an elderly military veteran as an investor, had used condescending language about the veteran's limited financial sophistication, and had never imagined that person was actually a highly trained fraud investigator who'd spent decades catching criminals exactly like Preston. The prosecutor said this miscalculation had been Preston's downfall. He'd become so arrogant from years of successful fraud that he'd stopped being cautious and had tried to recruit someone whose expertise far exceeded his own ability to deceive. 6 weeks after his arrest, facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, Preston agreed to plead guilty. The plea agreement required him to admit guilt to multiple felony counts including securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. He would receive a sentence between 20 and 30 years depending on his cooperation in asset recovery and prosecution of other fraud operators. He would forfeit all assets, the homes, cars, art, everything, for victim compensation. He would provide full cooperation with ongoing investigations. And he would admit in detail how he'd run the Ponzi scheme and deceived hundreds of investors. The plea hearing was held in a packed federal courtroom. Dozens of victim investors attended to watch Preston finally admit what he'd done. I sat in the front row, directly in Preston's line of sight, wanting him to see me as he confessed to the fraud I'd exposed. The judge asked Preston a series of questions to ensure he understood what he was pleading guilty to and that his plea was voluntary. Then the judge asked Preston to describe in his own words what he'd done. Preston stood at the defendant's table and admitted that he'd created Whitmore Capital Management as a fraud from the beginning. He'd never had legitimate investment expertise or strategies. He'd deceived wealthy investors by fabricating performance records, creating false financial statements, and using social connections and exclusivity to build trust. He'd stolen over $3 billion from hundreds of investors over 8 years. He'd spent hundreds of millions on personal luxuries while his investors thought their money was being professionally managed. He'd operated a classic Ponzi scheme, paying some investors with money from other investors while stealing massive amounts for himself. The judge then asked Preston about specific victims, requiring him to acknowledge the harm he'd caused. Preston admitted he'd stolen retirement savings from elderly people, depleted college funds from families, taken money from charities and foundations, and destroyed the financial security of hundreds of people who'd trusted him. His voice cracked with emotion, whether from genuine remorse or from self-pity about facing decades in prison was unclear. After Preston's admission, the prosecutor made a statement about the investigation. She described how an unnamed whistleblower with extensive financial fraud investigation experience had recognized Preston's scheme immediately and had conducted a comprehensive analysis that gave law enforcement everything needed to move quickly before more investors were harmed. The prosecutor said this case demonstrated the importance of fraud detection training and the value of experienced investigators, skills that had allowed the whistleblower to see through deception that had fooled sophisticated investors for years. The judge accepted Preston's guilty plea and scheduled sentencing for 3 months later. As marshals led Preston out of the courtroom, he looked directly at me one final time. I met his gaze steadily. He'd called me just a payroll clerk and had thought his sophisticated Wall Street financial expertise made him superior to an old military bookkeeper. He'd murdered my daughter, I was morally certain of that now, to silence her when she'd discovered his fraud. He'd tried to steal my life savings while condescending to me about my limited financial understanding. He'd learned that Air Force controllers aren't clerical workers. We're trained financial investigators who've analyzed billion-dollar budgets, caught sophisticated contractor fraud, investigated financial crimes, and testified in court about complex financial matters. His Wall Street arrogance and his expensive attorneys hadn't protected him from someone who'd spent 27 years developing fraud detection capabilities that exceeded anything his business school education had provided. The old payroll clerk had systematically dismantled his $3 billion fraud empire. And he was about to spend decades in federal prison thinking about how catastrophically he'd underestimated the woman he tried to defraud. The 3 years following Preston's guilty plea brought systematic recovery of assets, prosecution of his co-conspirators, and rebuilding of lives that had been devastated by his fraud. The court-appointed receiver worked tirelessly to trace, freeze, and liquidate Preston's assets for distribution to victim investors. It was painstaking work requiring international cooperation, forensic accounting across dozens of shell companies and offshore accounts, and legal battles with foreign banks and governments. But slowly, methodically, the receiver assembled a pool of recoverable assets totaling approximately $900 million. The asset recovery included liquidation of Preston's Manhattan penthouse, Hampton's estate, Aspen Chalet, and Palm Beach mansion for a combined $120 million. His collection of exotic cars, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, McLarens, a vintage Bugatti, sold at auction for $28 million. His yacht sold for $32 million, though it was worth far less than the $40 million he'd paid because luxury yachts depreciate dramatically. His art collection, curated with stolen money but including some genuinely valuable pieces, sold for $90 million. Wine collection, jewelry, watches, and other personal property added another $15 million. The receiver also recovered $200 million from the offshore accounts Preston had disclosed as part of his plea agreement, though international cooperation had been slow and several foreign banks had attempted to claim the funds couldn't be returned without lengthy legal proceedings. Federal prosecutors had made clear that countries refusing to cooperate in returning stolen assets would face diplomatic and financial consequences, which eventually motivated compliance. Most significantly, the receiver successfully pursued clawback actions against early Whitmore Capital Management investors who'd withdrawn more money than they'd invested. Under Ponzi scheme law, investors who'd profited from the fraud by withdrawing fictitious gains were required to return those funds because their profits had been paid with money stolen from later investors. Several dozen early investors fought these clawback actions, hiring expensive attorneys to argue they'd been innocent victims who shouldn't have to return money. But the legal precedents were clear, and most eventually settled or had judgments entered against them. These clawback recoveries totaled approximately $200 million. The final accounting showed approximately $900 million available for distribution to victim investors who'd lost over $3 billion. It meant victims would receive roughly 30 cents on the dollar, devastating losses, but better than the 10 to 15 cents originally projected. The receiver's work had made a significant difference in how much victims would recover, though it couldn't undo the fundamental damage Preston's decade of fraud had caused. I attended the victims' compensation distribution hearing where the court approved the receiver's final plan for allocating recovered assets. Over 100 victim investors attended, many elderly, many visibly emotional about finally receiving some portion of their stolen money. The judge praised the receiver's work and specifically mentioned the whistleblower whose investigation had enabled rapid law enforcement action before Preston could hide more assets or recruit additional victims who would have reduced the recovery percentage further. After the hearing, several victims approached me in the courthouse hallway. They'd figured out I was the whistleblower from news coverage and from references during court proceedings. They thanked me for exposing Preston's fraud and for providing the investigation that enabled asset recovery. One elderly man who'd lost $2 million told me he'd thought he was being smart by investing with an exclusive firm that generated consistent returns, never imagining he was giving his retirement savings to a criminal. He said receiving $600,000 back wasn't enough to restore his retirement security, but it was far better than nothing, and he was grateful I'd acted quickly. A woman in her 70s whose late husband had invested their life savings with Whitmore Capital Management told me she'd lost $3 million, her entire net worth. She was receiving approximately $900,000 in the distribution, enough to live modestly but nothing like the security she'd expected. She said the financial loss was devastating, but what hurt more was feeling stupid for being deceived. I told her what I'd been telling other victims. Preston had been a sophisticated criminal who'd deceived many intelligent people, and she shouldn't blame herself for trusting someone who'd built elaborate credibility through years of fraud. Several victims asked about my background and how I'd recognized Preston's fraud when so many others had been fooled. I explained my 27 years as an Air Force comptroller investigating financial crimes and auditing defense programs. I described how the training and experience gave me pattern recognition capabilities that helped identify fraud indicators most people would miss. Several said they wished they'd had someone with my expertise review the investment before they'd committed their money. I suggested that in the future, they should always get independent verification of any investment opportunity and should be skeptical of consistent high returns that seem too good to be true. The criminal case against Preston's co-conspirators proceeded through prosecution and sentencing. 7 Whitmore Capital Management employees who'd knowingly participated in the fraud pleaded guilty to conspiracy and fraud charges. Sentences ranged from 3 to 12 years depending on their level of involvement and cooperation. The chief financial officer who'd created the false financial statements received 12 years. The chief operating officer who'd managed the cover-up of the fraud received 10 years. Several marketing executives who'd knowingly recruited investors with false performance claims received 5 to 7 years. 4 months after his guilty plea, Preston appeared for sentencing. The courtroom was packed with victim investors who wanted to see justice delivered. The prosecutors recommended a sentence of 30 years, emphasizing the massive scale of the fraud, the number of victims, the decade of deception, and Preston's lack of genuine remorse. Preston's attorneys argued for the minimum sentence of 20 years, claiming he'd cooperated with asset recovery and prosecution of other fraudsters and deserved credit for that cooperation. Then came victim impact statements. 12 victims had been selected to address the court about how Preston's fraud had affected their lives. An elderly couple described losing their entire retirement savings and having to move in with their adult children because they could no longer afford their home. A man explained how his mother's inheritance that was supposed to fund her nursing home care had been stolen, forcing difficult decisions about her medical treatment. A foundation director described how their endowment's losses had forced them to eliminate programs serving disadvantaged children. The statements were heartbreaking and powerful. Several victims cried while describing the devastation Preston had caused. Several directly addressed Preston, asking how he could have lived with himself while destroying so many lives for personal greed. Preston sat at the defense table showing no emotion, staring straight ahead, apparently unwilling or unable to face the people he'd harmed. I was the final person to give a victim impact statement. I stood at the podium and told the court about my daughter Caroline discovering Preston's fraud and attempting to gather evidence to report him. I described her suspicious death from aggressive cancer that appeared suddenly and killed her before she could expose Preston's crimes. I told the court I believed Preston had murdered my daughter, though I couldn't prove it, because her death had been extraordinarily convenient for someone whose multi-billion-dollar fraud was about to be exposed. I described how Preston had approached me after Caroline's death trying to access my assets for his Ponzi scheme. I told the court how he'd dismissed my Air Force financial career as simple payroll work and had condescended to me about my limited financial understanding. I explained how his arrogance and his underestimation of my capabilities had been his downfall. If he'd researched my background, he would have known I was the worst possible person to try to defraud because my entire military career had been dedicated to detecting and investigating exactly the kind of financial crimes he was committing. I told the court that Preston represented the worst kind of criminal, someone who used sophistication, social connections, and exclusivity to build trust, then betrayed that trust to steal from people who'd worked their entire lives to accumulate savings. I said his fraud had destroyed not just financial security but also trust, confidence, and peace of mind for hundreds of victims. I asked the court to impose the maximum sentence possible to reflect the severity of his crimes and to deter others who might consider similar fraud schemes. The judge listened to all the victim statements, reviewed the pre-sentencing report, and heard arguments from both prosecutors and defense attorneys. Then he delivered his sentencing decision. The judge said Preston had committed one of the most egregious financial frauds in modern history. He'd deceived hundreds of victims, stolen over $3 billion, lived an obscenely lavish lifestyle on stolen money, and shown no genuine remorse for the devastation he'd caused. The judge said the cooperation Preston had provided didn't come close to mitigating the severity of his crimes. The judge sentenced Preston to 30 years in federal prison, 3 years supervised release after completing his prison term, and ordered him to pay $3.2 billion in restitution. The judge said Preston should spend the next 3 decades in prison thinking about the lives he'd destroyed through his greed and deception. As federal marshals led Preston away to begin his sentence, he looked back at the courtroom gallery one final time. His eyes found me, and I met his gaze steadily. The confusion and arrogance were gone, replaced by the reality that he'd spend the rest of his productive life in prison. The years following Preston's sentencing brought opportunities to use my experience preventing others from becoming fraud victims. I established the Caroline Sullivan Financial Fraud Education Foundation using the life insurance money from Caroline's death, money Preston had probably planned to access. The foundation provided free financial fraud awareness education to seniors, military families, and other vulnerable populations. It also funded research into fraud detection techniques and provided grants to organizations working to protect consumers from investment scams. I was invited to teach financial fraud detection at the Air Force Institute of Technology where I'd once earned my master's degree. I developed courses for comptroller officers on recognizing Ponzi schemes, analyzing questionable financial statements, and conducting fraud investigations. I gave guest lectures at business schools about how military financial training provided fraud detection capabilities that often exceeded civilian education. Several universities incorporated my case studies into their accounting and finance curricula as examples of sophisticated fraud and the techniques used to expose it. The FBI asked me to join their financial crimes task force as a senior advisor, consulting on major fraud investigations. I worked on multiple cases involving Ponzi schemes, investment fraud, and financial crimes where my experience analyzing complex financial operations proved valuable. In several cases, I identified fraud indicators that other investigators had missed, enabling earlier intervention before frauds grew larger or more victims were harmed. The FBI credited my work with helping expose 3 additional Ponzi schemes totaling over $1 billion in claimed assets. The SEC asked me to serve on an advisory committee examining how to improve detection of investment fraud before schemes grew to massive size. I provided recommendations based on my experience investigating Preston's operation, emphasizing the importance of following up promptly on red flags, not being intimidated by expensive attorneys, and having investigators with sufficient expertise to analyze sophisticated financial operations. Several of my recommendations were incorporated into new SEC examination procedures. I also testified before Congress about financial fraud protection and investor education. I described how Preston's fraud had operated for a decade despite multiple warning signs because regulators were understaffed and because wealthy investors often believed themselves too sophisticated to be fraud victims. I recommended increased funding for financial regulatory agencies, better education about fraud indicators, and legal reforms to make it easier to prosecute financial fraud and recover stolen assets. I'm Margaret Sullivan, 72 years old now. I'm a retired Air Force comptroller and fraud investigator who spent 27 years auditing billion-dollar defense budgets, investigating financial crimes, and learning that fraud detection is about recognizing patterns, analyzing inconsistencies, and understanding that when something seems too good to be true, it usually is. I'm a mother who lost her daughter to a criminal who murdered her to protect his fraud empire. Preston Whitmore called me just a payroll clerk and dismissed my military financial career as simple bookkeeping that hadn't prepared me to understand sophisticated Wall Street investment strategies. He murdered my daughter when she discovered his crimes. He tried to steal my life savings while condescending about my limited financial understanding. He operated a $3 billion Ponzi scheme for a decade, living extravagantly on stolen money while deceiving hundreds of wealthy, intelligent investors. He learned that Air Force controllers aren't clerical workers processing paychecks. We're trained financial investigators who analyze complex budgets, detect sophisticated fraud, conduct forensic accounting, and build prosecution cases that withstand the most aggressive legal defense. His MBA and his Wall Street pedigree couldn't protect him from someone who'd spent nearly 3 decades catching criminals who thought they were too smart to be caught. To anyone whose financial expertise has been dismissed as simple bookkeeping, stand your ground. Military controllers and financial investigators receive training that often exceeds civilian accounting education. We learn fraud detection through examining operations where mistakes or crimes waste taxpayer money and endanger national security. That training creates capabilities that are permanent and actually improve through decades of application. Preston's $3 billion fraud empire collapsed because he thought financial sophistication meant knowing Wall Street jargon and marketing tactics. He didn't understand that real financial expertise meant analyzing operations, recognizing fraud patterns, conducting systematic investigations, and building comprehensive evidence packages. Those capabilities don't come from business school, they come from years of examining financial operations and catching people who try to hide crimes through complexity. This is Colonel Rep. Margaret Sullivan, United States Air Force, signing off. To my fellow military financial professionals, your expertise matters more than Wall Street might acknowledge. Comptroller training, audit experience, and fraud investigation skills are more valuable than many civilian credentials. Age and experience make you more capable at detecting financial crimes, not less. Keep serving, keep investigating, and prove that military financial training creates fraud detection capabilities that protect people from criminals who underestimate us. The old payroll clerk proved that 27 years of Air Force financial investigation training defeats Wall Street arrogance and billion-dollar fraud schemes every single time.